Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. We are at McIntyre's. It's a happy Friday night here, nice and loud, and that's good. We love the ambiance. We've been here many times before. We appreciate their hospitality. David Sanger is our special guest. David Sanger is the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. He is also author of a new book. I'm almost finished with it. I really do try to read all the books before I have the guests on the show. New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David, great to see you.
Great to be back here with you, Major. It's funny, whenever I run into you, it always seems to be in a noisy bar. I can't imagine why that could be.
What are the chances?
Yeah.
What are the chances? So it will. This first question, David, will sound as if I've only read the prologue. I guarantee you I've read nearly all of the book, but the prologue ends with a sentence that I think is such a great stepping off point for the book. Well, it ought to. It's the prologue. It ought to get things rolling. Here's the sentence. Talking about the times in which we live and the national security challenges facing the United States and, by extension, the West. It's part 1914, part 1941, and part 2022 all at once. What does that mean?
Well, the prelude to that quote is a line from Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who said, you know, at the beginning of the Ukraine war, we thought this was going to be a cyber war. Then we thought it was an old-fashioned World War II tank war. And then we thought it was World War I.
Trench warfare.
Trench warfare.
Or something like that.
Yeah, and he may have had an army epithet or two thrown into that before it was World War I. Right. And that's really the remarkable moment that we are in. Because on the one hand, you have seen in Ukraine, and you have seen in Gaza, and you have seen in the U.S.-China conflict, the use of the most extraordinary new technologies, facial recognition, electronic ways of tracking down adversaries. You've seen the use of satellites. You've seen the use of the most exquisite cyber technologies. And you have seen the most old-fashioned brutality. And, you know, there was a moment, maybe even with my last book, The Perfect Weapon, which came out 5 years ago, where we thought we were heading toward this world of clean conflicts that were going to be struggles between nation states, but essentially weren't going to kill innocent civilians. Boy, were we wrong.
Flat wrong.
Yeah.
There's so much in this book, and I really highly recommend it. Look, if you're listening or watching the show, you are tuned in not only to the news, but you're trying to figure out the construct of our times. I read a lot of books. You know the guests we have on this show. David and I are friends, but I don't say this because we're friends. It's the best book synthesizing our times that I have come across. Some books are reporters' books, chock full of reporters' notebook factoids, and those are great. Some books are analytical books, and some books are narrative books that try to get a sweep of a time. This book is all three. It's a reporter's book, it's an analytical book, it's a narrative book. But as you were finishing it, David, Gaza's attack on Israel occurs. That has been a wrenching 6-month, horrific conflict, changing all sorts of dynamics in the Middle East. How does that fit or not fit within the things you were trying to bring to the surface and help your readers understand better?
Well, it fits in pretty centrally because on the one hand, we've got what this calls New Cold Wars with an S, which is to say a simultaneous superpower competition with China and with Russia, but also with China and Russia combining their forces together. I think back, Major, just to 2015, when the United States was negotiating the Iran nuclear agreement. Who was sitting on the U.S. side of the table?
Right.
You and I were out there, and
we were,
and the whole bit. You had the U.S., you had the Europeans, you had the Chinese and the Russians on the same side, right? And the Russians were actually pretty helpful in that negotiation. And in the end, they ended up taking Iran's nuclear material, the enriched uranium, taking it to Russia, blending it down. They were fundamentally on board with the thought that a nuclear Iran was not in their interest. Where are we a mere 9 years later? Iran is the major supplier to Ukraine. The Russians are going to do anything to keep that going. They have been perfectly happy to see the Iranian proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, engage the United States. They've done absolutely nothing to restrain this war. The Chinese have been perfectly happy at a moment that the U.S. was supposed to be doing the pivot to Asia to see this going on. They don't want it to get too bad because they don't want to interrupt their own oil flows. But boy, if the United States is once again wrapped in dealing with terrorism in the Middle East, well, that's how China got to the position it's in today.
And you talked about this, but I want you to get a little bit more specific with my audience. What is it that Iran is providing to Russia that is making a difference in the Ukrainian battlefield?
Two things. The first and biggest is, of course, the drones. At a moment that Iran had, at a moment that the Russians had very little drone capability, they built it up now, they were able to buy the Shahed drones from Iran, load them up, and use that to counter what was an increasingly effective drone force from Ukraine. The second thing they're doing is they're providing artillery and, we think soon, short-range missiles. The North Koreans are doing big artillery and many of their missiles. A lot of them are duds, they're not working terribly well. But if you take a look at this constellation, China, which said it is in a partnership with no limits with Russia, but we've discovered some limits, North Korea and Iran, you have the core of what they call the axis of resistance. That is resistance to the United States and a Western way of incorporating. And the big message of this book is that we got it wrong after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we got it wrong in the first 20 years of reformers in China, that this meant that we were on a path toward democracy and not brutality and authoritarianism taking hold. And even in Biden's first 2 years in office, how many times did you and I sit through press conferences where he said, this is a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, and we have to show people democracy works. Well, there's a lot of skepticism that democracy works right now, and part of that skepticism comes from the fact that the Biden administration has had a much harder time declaring that brutality in Gaza is morally equivalent to the brutality we have seen taking place in Ukraine or other places. There are all kinds of reasons for that, but boy, it's been an effective talking point for the Russians.
So David, I'm going to set this question up so we can talk about it on the other side of the break, because I don't want to put this question to you and say you have 15 seconds to begin an answer to it. But two thoughts before we go into the break. One, there's a chapter in the book called The Lost Decades. When we come back, I want you to explain what those lost decades were and how damaging what was lost actually is in real time. And secondly, I want you to evaluate something that has always been a bedrock strength of the United States, which is its economic prowess and its economic stability vis-a-vis its adversaries. Those are the two topics when we come back. I'm Major Garrett. David Sanger is our special guest. McIntyre's is our host restaurant. Fish and chips are coming to the table momentarily, I promise you. We thank McIntyre's for their hospitality. Back with David Sanger and the new book, The New Cold Wars, in a moment.
We took our eye off the ball of the fundamental competitions that would decide America's future.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Our guest, David Sanger, White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. We're at McIntyre's. That's the happy sound you hear around us. David's new book, New Cold Wars. So I put two questions to you, David. Let me repeat them to you briefly. The lost decades, what were they? Why do they matter? And in all of these ideas and concepts about new Cold Wars, is the United States economically ready? And is that economic prowess long an advantage for the United States in all superpower conflicts as advantageous as it once was?
So on the first part, the lost decades were the decades in which the U.S. was so wrapped up in the wars on terror, for good and understandable reasons, that we took our eye off the ball of the fundamental competitions that would decide America's future. Let me give you one simple one, and the book goes into this in some detail. It's the loss of our ability to produce the most advanced semiconductors. Here's a technology that was invented in the United States, Texas Instruments, Intel, all that. When I first went into journalism in the early 1980s, I was covering Silicon Valley and Intel when it dominated the world. It made the IBM personal computer business, and that made Intel. But there were a series of business decisions that were made not only by Intel but by many other companies over the course of 20 years that basically moved the production of the chips largely to Taiwan, some to other places, but the most advanced chips to Taiwan Semiconductor, the company that makes the microprocessor at the heart of your iPhone, that makes all the chips for NVIDIA, which are powering artificial intelligence applications. And somehow...
And they're in weapon systems too.
And weapon systems as well. And some combination of the COVID supply chain traumas and the recognition that if there was a war in Taiwan or over Taiwan, we would lose access to the central technology that drives everything from your washing machine to your car to your F-15.
Right.
That this was going to be a great crisis. And yet, was anyone in the U.S. government looking at these individual business decisions and saying, look, they may make sense for the shareholders of any individual company, Motorola, Texas Instruments, Intel, you name it, but they don't make sense for the national security of the United States, you know? I usually, when I think about these kind of problems, I try to do it by analogy. So, would you let the Russians manufacture the uniforms that American soldiers wear? Sure, they can do it cheaply. You can fight a war without just the right camouflage. We'll find some way to rev it up. Would you let the Russians design the innards of the B-2 bomber or your nuclear weapon system? Of course not. You'd be laughed out of the building. Semiconductors are so much closer to the B-2 example or the nuclear weapons complex example, and yet we don't give it a second thought. We think, well, this is a commercial activity. Now, finally, because of the CHIPS Act that Biden and the Democratic Congress passed 2 years ago, we're putting $52 billion into semiconductors. Sounds like a lot of money. Major, do you know what the last U.S. aircraft carrier we built was?
The Gerald Ford.
That's right.
I read it in the book.
Yeah, that's right.
$13 billion.
That's right. 13, 14, maybe with cost overruns, $15 billion, right? That's about the price tag for building a pretty advanced but not super advanced semiconductor fabrication plant. If I went to Congress today and I said, we're falling behind the Chinese in manufacturing aircraft carriers, which by and large are sitting ducks these days, we need 10 more, I think you'd get it through.
Right.
If I went to them and said, we need 10 more 3-nanometer fabs, that's the diameter of the smallest circuits on the chip, they'd say, that's industrial policy.
Right. We don't do that in America.
That's right. Now, we did do it with the CHIPS Act, and it's a start. But when all those fabs are built, by the Biden administration's own projection, we will get back maybe 20% of the manufacturing market.
So that leads to the second question. Is our economic approach more harmful than beneficial? And is it still net an advantage in these emerging new Cold Wars?
It is a net advantage in the development of advanced technologies. You know, for all the Chinese worked on artificial intelligence, and they're still working on it, generative AI came out of American firms by and large, and European firms. But our ability to go marshal that toward a national defense, national security capability has weakened considerably. And that at a moment when, as the book points out, we are more reliant on American companies than ever for early warning, for example. So there's a section at the beginning of the book where I take you into the State Department's thinking in the days before the Ukraine war. You know, they're releasing intelligence about evidence that Putin is getting ready to invade. But the weekend before the war, I'm at the Munich Security Conference, and I've got all these leaders of Europe saying to me, oh, the Russians aren't going to do this, David. They're just bluffing. They're just trying to extract some more parts of Ukraine, but they won't really invade. And the Saturday before, I sat down with Secretary of State Blinken, who've known for many years, long before he was Secretary of State, and we were comparing a list of people who told us the war wouldn't start. And it was incredibly long. It included the German intelligence chief, who was caught in Kyiv the morning the war broke out 4 days later. They had to evacuate him. So that's the view from the government side. I then take you into Microsoft's warning center outside of Dulles Airport, where they're seeing evidence of cyber attacks inside Ukraine against Ukrainian government operations. And they sent a warning to their own staff, which then went to Ann Neuberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, and then to Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, that these cyber attacks look like they are a prelude to the war. And they were.
That touches on something else that is also talked about in your earlier book, The Perfect Weapon. David was on this show to talk about that, and Neuberger, who he just name-checked, was on this show just 2 or 3 weeks ago. If you're curious about this, I urge you to go back to the archives, listen to that episode. That in this cyberspace, and I mean that broadly, the space of cyber, warning systems are not just governmental. They are private sector, and they are collaborative. And as I read your book, both of them, they must be. That's a new reality.
They've got to be in part because U.S. intelligence agencies are forbidden from going inside U.S. companies, and they're forbidden from going inside U.S. networks. But if you're trying to figure out the communications going on among adversaries, it frequently is going to be inside a network that Microsoft or Google or Amazon World Services sees, and the NSA cannot.
Right. They've got eyes on, and is that eyes on real time?
It can be. It depends on the nature of the communications. And these technologies are not miracle workers. For the first year and a half or 2 years, the American technological edge that we gave the Ukrainians made a huge difference. We gave Ukraine Project Maven, which was the Pentagon's collection effort to be able to see all sources of intelligence, put them on a single pane of glass, so you can see satellite photographs, Telegram and Twitter messages, Instagram posts that may show, say, hidden sniper post or tank.
Hold that thought, David. I need you to hold that thought. Pregnant pause. Segment 3 of The Takeout with David Sanger of the New York Times in just one moment.
President Biden's instructions were, don't let the Russians win, but don't start World War III.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Delighted to have David Sanger with us, White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. David, you were mid-sentence, and I had to interrupt you to go to break about technology and what we were providing to the Ukrainians, what they were seeing, and how, to use a guttural phrase, whiz-bang it all was on a single screen, if you will.
So this single stream of data was enormously helpful to them, and it explains why they were able to...
And worth pointing out, in a wartime scenario never before seen.
That's right. And to the Pentagon, this was a great moment to test out this technology because they had developed it for years, but it had never actually been used in battle. And only then do you discover what works and what doesn't. So what did we discover? It was enormously helpful at targeting the Russians. It enabled the Ukrainians to make up for the fact that the U.S. was not out there pulling triggers because President Biden's instructions were, don't let the Russians win, but don't start World War III, right? So these were somewhat in tension. And it explains why the Ukrainians were able to hit Russian ships in the Red Sea. I'm sorry, in the oceans right off of Crimea. It explains why the Ukrainians were able to kill generals in command posts. But now, all of a sudden, that age seems gone.
Right.
And so the question is why? Has the technology gotten worse? No. The Russians learned how to adapt. They finally brought in good electronic warfare that has stymied a lot of the Ukrainian drones. They have added bodies. This week, we heard that from Christopher Cavoli, the European commander, that the Russians have now added enough soldiers that their force is 15% bigger than it was on the day of the invasion, despite the casualties that they have suffered. We now know that the Ukrainians are being outgunned by the Russians in artillery about 10 rounds to 1. And so all the good intelligence in the world isn't going to help you if you simply don't have the mass, the numbers, and the artillery to shoot back with.
To use the Silicon Valley word, to be able to fight at scale.
That's right. That's right.
And the Russians can fight at scale.
And they have learned how to come up and make up for the deficiencies they had. And they've learned a lot from watching us.
Where do you think, if you were to describe for this audience, David, the war in Ukraine currently is?
The best thing you could say about it is a stalemate. The worst you could say is some advantage to the Russians. And that's particularly concerning because if you're Vladimir Putin, you have no motivation to go out and try to do a settlement until you see how the American election comes out. Because what's he reading? That Donald Trump says that he'll end the war in 24 hours? Well, that'd be fine. What's it take to go do that? But it turns out giving the territory that the Russians want to the Russians without consulting particularly the Ukrainians.
Right. I want to ask you about Afghanistan. There's a substantial chapter in the book about what happened with the evacuation, and you observe, as others have, that the White House was willing to blame everyone and anyone but itself for that evacuation. It has had a discernible political consequence for this White House. Every bit of polling shows the president was above water before the Afghanistan withdrawal. He fell below water, meaning his net approval was above before Afghanistan. It fell below, meaning he was more disapproved than approved after Afghanistan. How much of that is a legitimate referendum on the White House approach and the blunders or misjudgments surrounding the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Let me start by saying the withdrawal itself was the one thing on which Donald Trump and Joe Biden agreed upon in the 2020 election. And you and I know we could count those on just a couple of fingers, right? But they both said we had to get out. Trump had declared the previous Christmas that everybody was going to leave like in a week or two until his Secretary of State had to go by quietly and say, you can't do that. You're going to abandon our allies. You're going to leave people frozen in space. You're going to get a lot of people killed. So Trump left it for Biden. Biden took the position that he had taken throughout the Obama administration, which is that the U.S. needed to reduce and ultimately get out. Nothing wrong with that. But having made that decision in April, he needed a plan that was going to enable the United States not only to get its own forces out, but to get out the SIVs, the special individuals who had
Special
helped
immigrant
American
visa candidates.
That's right.
Translators, cooks, logistics experts, other Afghans who had essentially chosen sides, helped the Americans in ways large, medium, and small, and whose fate was in the hands, in all likelihood, of the, let us say, unmerciful Taliban.
So the U.S. had an intelligence failure about how quickly the Taliban would move in, or more specifically, how quickly the Ukrainian forces that the U.S. had spent 2 decades training would collapse. They had a failure of imagination about what kind of rush that would lead to. In the July 4th weekend of 2021, I was pool at the White House, a thankless job you and I have had more times than we can count, right? And the president came out to announce some good economic news, but it turned out the previous night, the U.S. had overnight evacuated Bagram Air Force Base, which of course had been the center of gravity of the U.S. forces. And I asked him, how could you do that in the middle of an evacuation when you may need that space to go move people in, to have the airlift? I said, no problem. We'll have over-the-horizon intelligence about what's happening. We'll have the ability to get there quickly. It will not affect our evacuation plans. Well, it sure did. Now, there was
let's just put a pin on that. Of the 3 things you just summarized, wrong, wrong, wrong.
Absolutely. Now, the one good thing that came out of this, I mean, obviously there were the deaths of 13
U.S. service
incredibly
personnel.
brave service personnel. The good thing that came out of it was that the team around Biden, very closed, been with him for years, learned that their comfort with each other did not guarantee that they were making the right decisions. And I actually think they responded better in Ukraine. The Ukraine crisis came up a few months later for this failure, just as Kennedy responded better to the Cuban Missile Crisis because he screwed up the Bay of Pigs.
I think there's an important historical comparison there, David, and I'm glad you brought up John F. Kennedy. I didn't know you would, because I was going to get to this. After the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy had a very famous press conference, the preparation for which is detailed in several books. And there was a whole mechanism beneath the president about how to explain this and where to direct blame. And the president told his advisors, then he told the nation, it's my fault. The responsibility lies entirely with me, and it is my fault. There is a belligerence about the Biden White House not to do that. And I believe that is part of the political impact that this has had and continues to have.
It could be. It could be. That said, I think they get as bad as Afghanistan was, and I would never, this chapter is pretty brutal.
It is.
I had a very senior member of the Biden administration say to me, am I going to like this book? I said, well, don't read the Afghanistan chapter. On the other hand, I think they actually handled the run-up to the war about as skillfully as anybody could. And they hoped that their revelation of the intelligence...
The Ukraine war.
The Ukraine war would stop Putin. It did not. In the book, you get pretty chapter and verse on that, including some remarkable on-the-record testimony from Bill Burns, the CIA director, and Biden's overall fix-it person on everything from the Middle East to other topics, about his meetings with Putin to basically warn him, and Putin didn't believe him.
We're going to talk about Vladimir Putin and Ukraine when we come back. I'm Major Garrett. McIntyre's is our host restaurant. We thank them for their hospitality. Segment 4 of the Takeout coming your way in just one moment.
Putin came out and gave a speech in which he was quite clear. He said, there are parts of Mother Russia, the Russia of Peter the Great, that have been ripped away from us and that will be restored.
Welcome back to the Takeout. David Sanger, White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. Our guest, his new book, New Cold Wars, the subtitle, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. I want to ask you about Vladimir Putin and the things you learned about it and the things that led up to the invasion of Ukraine, and most importantly, David, where the end game might possibly be found. And I want to start with this question. And the book touches on this, and it's my deepest fear about where the end game will be. Will anyone in the West, care as much about Ukraine as Vladimir Putin?
They can. And this was Obama's point when he, to my mind, under-responded to the annexation.
Soft invasion of Crimea.
And he said, look, we're not going to go to war for a Russian-speaking peninsula that most Americans can't find on the map that was part of Russia for several hundred years. But Ukraine itself, the full Ukraine, is different.
Much different.
Much different. And Putin knew that the very fact that it's not a member of NATO made it a much harder decision for the U.S. and its allies about how they would defend them. Clearly, he underestimated what the response would be. But one of the arguments of the book is that we misjudge Putin time and time again. 7 years before Crimea, in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin came out and gave a speech in which he was quite clear. He said, there are parts of Mother Russia, the Russia of Peter the Great, that have been ripped away from us and that will be restored. That was during the Bush administration. And it's what led President Bush and his national security advisor, Steve Hadley, who we just saw at McIntyre's a few minutes ago, to conclude that they needed to go have a chat with Putin and figure out what this was about. So Hadley secretly went off.
Right.
He goes to meet Putin. The encounter is described in the book.
Yes, it is, vividly.
And he came back really worried. 7 years later comes Crimea. The year after that, in 2015, Chancellor Merkel of Germany signed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline agreement with the Russians, which called for the creation of a new pipeline from Russia around Ukraine, cutting it out of the revenue, and straight to Europe. And what did she say? The Russians are a reliable supplier.
Yeah.
So the German view, like the American view, was you had to embrace Putin in a bear hug to keep him from acting against us. And they held on to that view until the day of the invasion in February of 2022.
It is something that is discussed in Washington, but I want you to give your perspective on this question to my audience. When we think about the relationship with Russia and Putin, we should not think of it in Soviet, meaning Stalin or Khrushchev or Lenin. We should think of it in Peter the Great context, correct?
The book keeps saying that time and again. Look, you go into Putin's office, I've only been in once. It was with Bush. There are no paintings of Stalin or Lenin. There's a big bust of Peter the Great. His view, Putin's view of the communist leaders is that they were all idiots who empowered the Soviet republics to think they had a fair bit of autonomy, and when they had the opportunity to exercise that autonomy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of them chose to join NATO and the West. He's deeply bitter about this. And so he's not trying simply to undo what happened with their joining NATO. He's trying to undo what Stalin and Lenin had done.
And there's something generational about this also, isn't there? Meaning young Russians resent what they perceive to be the soft communist leaders who let all these terrible things happen?
That's true, but think about what a change this is from 20 years ago. You know, an early scene in the book is President Bush and his wife, Laura, and Putin and his then wife floating down the Neva River outside St. Petersburg. They're on this big party boat. I was on the pool boat behind. We were not eating as well. In fact, we were not eating as well as we were eating at McIntyre's. And serving the leaders dinner was this brooding guy standing behind them, who, from looking at the pictures later, we identify as Prigozhin.
Yes.
Who shows up in the book 20 years later marching on Moscow.
Quickly remind my audience who Prigozhin is.
Prigozhin started as Putin's chef.
The guy who cooked his food, his chef.
Hard scrabble life, criminal background, works his way to the center of Putin's heart, starts the Internet Research Agency that worked to influence the 2016 election, went on to start the Wagner Group, which he denied running for years, which of course saved Putin's bacon in Ukraine until it turned against him.
Right.
Okay, so during this float down the river, Putin and Bush are talking about the days ahead when Russia could join the European Union. They're talking about the possibility that Russia might join NATO, the alliance created, Major, to contain the old Soviet Union. And in fact, it wasn't a wild thought because there was a NATO-Russia council.
Yes.
And you'd go in the gates of NATO and you could go to Russia's office.
Right, right.
Today, that is a NATO-Ukraine council.
Right.
So we convinced ourselves along the way that at the end of the day, for all of his historical grievances, Putin would decide that the oil revenue was too important and he would not upset the apple cart. We were wrong. We made a parallel assessment about Xi Jinping when he came into power a decade ago. And that was that China was so invested in its integration with the West, with its membership in the World Trade Organization, with its supplying of Walmart and American electronics firms, that when Xi Jinping came to the Obama White House and said, we're not going to militarize the South China Sea, or we will come up with peaceful ways out of the problem with Taiwan, that he really felt hemmed in. And it turned out we had that one wrong too. I argue the Putin mistake was a bigger one because the evidence was out front. With Xi Jinping, it took years to discover his secret speeches where he said, we are going to build up our nuclear weapons stockpile to be equivalent to the Russians and the Americans.
I want to let our audience know that we're going to go to the Takeout Outtake Especial in a moment. And because David has been a guest on the show, he's already answered the 3 threshold questions. So the Takeout Outtake Especial will pick up where we just left off, which is a little bit more, a little bit deeper on China and the China's Rise part of his book, New Cold Wars. Again, the subtitle, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David Sanger has been our special guest. We thank McIntyre's to be our host restaurant. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial in just one moment.
It's almost as if Americans expect the rest of the world to stand still while we're working this out among ourselves. They ain't doing that.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. David Sanger, White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times, our special guest. China. We haven't talked about it as much as we probably should, so I want to give you the last 3 minutes. There is a sense that everything that Americans hear right now about China is negative. There's a fear in Washington that it is so hyper-negative that it is obscuring truths about China. Talk to me about that. That there's a kind of hysteria going on about China.
There is, and it's almost 1950s-like.
Feels like it.
Yeah. The first thing we need to understand is the Chinese state is not 10 feet tall.
Not 10 feet tall, right.
Their growth has slowed down to 3%. They finally hit that turn in the river that everybody's been waiting for 20 years. They've launched a number of state-owned, state-directed operations on high technology, the 2025 project, which built up their capacity in semiconductors, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, long-range batteries, solar, everything that our Congress wants us to do. And they've been very successful in some, and in semiconductors in particular, not so successful. In part because the Biden administration has, much more skillfully than I thought they would, deprived them of the most advanced semiconductors and the equipment to make them. But there is a temptation, because Russia is the more urgent problem, to forget that China is the most important long-term problem. It is the only country with the military, economic, political, and technological capability to challenge us in the long term. And getting a divided Congress and a divided populace to think in strategic terms about China and competing with it at a moment that we're also supposed to be thinking in strategic terms about Russia, a very different kind of challenger. You know, China's climate change, as they say, Russia's just the hurricane, right?
Right.
The difficulty of getting us to do that is really hard. And one thing that worries me, Major, is that we're not as good as a country and a populace thinking about geostrategy as we were 60 years ago. I mean, listen to the Nixon-Kennedy debates. Forget for a minute who's sweating, who looks old, who looks young. Just turn on the audio and turn off the video.
Right.
Something your video viewers are probably wishing they're doing right now. Okay,
Certainly in my case, they always think that.
Right. And what you hear is a really sophisticated argument about the nature of nuclear deterrence that no one would sit still for today, right? And I'm not blaming Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I'm not blaming Democrats and Republicans. We have lost the ability, because for the past 30 years we haven't had to think about it, to ask the question, if we create a vacuum in the world, who is going to fill it? How are our interests going to be harmed if they do fill it? What interests do we care about and what we don't? I teach a national security course with Graham Allison at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and the first thing we try to get students to think about is a hierarchy of national interests.
Right. What's first, what's second, what's third, what's fourth, what's
What are the
fifth?
things that are important to do and you'd like to do, but you simply can't afford to do? We don't conduct our debates in a hierarchy of national interests.
Right.
We wrap ourselves around social issues, around important questions that we've got to resolve domestically, but it's almost as if Americans expect the rest of the world to stand still while we're working this out among ourselves. They ain't doing that.
That is the voice of David Sanger, and if this show is devoted to anything, it is to lengthen our collective attention span. That's why I created this show. That's why we have a lot of time. That's why we have long, what I hope are deeply informative conversations. David Sanger, thank you for, in your way, advancing what I consider to be a noble pursuit.
Well, Major, you and I, for more years than we'd like to admit, have been out covering this place, trying to understand it, debating it in the back of buses or over really bad meals. This was a quite good one.
Yeah.
And it's just such a pleasure to be doing this with you.
Thank you so much, David. We'll see you next week, folks.